The living room was filled with the usual fake laughter and chatter from my relatives. But my heart was pounding. My father's voice cut through the noise like a knife. "Sophia, stand up," he barked. All eyes turned to me. My face grew hot as I stood up, not knowing what I had done wrong this time. My parents never needed much of a reason to make me the scapegoat. My harmless joke about a fake inheritance check at dinner was the perfect excuse. "You thought that was funny?" my father shouted, his face red with anger. "Embarrassing us in front of everyone?" "It was just a joke," I stammered, my voice shaking. "I didn't mean." "You didn't mean?" my mother interrupted, her voice sharp like a knife. "Do you think this family is a joke, Sophia?" Before I could answer, my father grabbed a piece of cord from the corner of the room. My stomach sank as he marched toward me. "Sit down," he yelled, pointing at a chair in the middle of the room. Humiliated, I sank into the chair. He tied my wrists tightly, the rope digging into my skin. I fought back tears as laughter and whispers spread through the room. My younger brother, Liam, leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, a smug look on his face. "This," my father announced, pointing at me, "is what happens when you disrespect this family." The shame was overwhelming, but I bit my lip, refusing to cry. My parents kept yelling, but their words became a blur. I wished I could disappear. Then, the door burst open. The loud noise made everyone go silent. Standing in the doorway was a man I hadn't seen in years, my Uncle Richard. He looked out of place in his expensive suit, his eyes cold as they took in the scene. His gaze stopped on me, tied up and humiliated. "What is going on here?" he demanded, his voice low and threatening. My father straightened up, his confidence faltering. "Richard, this isn't your business." Richard stepped into the room, his presence powerful. "It is now." The room felt heavy with tension as Richard walked over to me. He knelt in front of me, his eyes softening. "Are you okay, Sophie?" I nodded, though my throat was tight with unshed tears. Richard stood up, facing my parents. "Untie her," he ordered, his voice cold. "This is discipline," my mother argued. "She needs to learn respect." Richard's voice rose, his anger barely contained. "This isn't discipline, it's cruelty." My father hesitated, but Richard's fierce glare left him no choice. Grumbling, he loosened the ropes. My wrists were free, red marks left behind. Richard turned to me. "Go pack your things." "What?" my mother yelled. "You can't just take her." "Oh, I can," Richard replied, his voice icy. "And I will. You've proven you don't deserve her." "You don't understand." My father tried to argue, but Richard cut him off. "No, Peter. I understand perfectly. I've watched you tear her down for years. That ends today." My parents looked panicked. They couldn't challenge Richard. He was wealthy and powerful, and they depended on him. "This is a mistake," my mother hissed, her face twisted with anger. "The only mistake," Richard said calmly, "is how you've treated your daughter." He turned to me, his face softening. "You're coming with me. You don't belong here." I followed Richard out of the house, my steps slow at first, then faster as the weight of the room lifted. The cold night air felt like freedom. His sleek black car waited in the driveway, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Richard opened the passenger door. "Get in," he said, his voice firm but kind. I got into the car, my heart racing. As we drove away, I looked back once, just once, to see my parents standing on the porch. My mother's face was full of rage. My father looked stunned, his usual arrogance gone. Liam peeked out from behind them, his smirk replaced by something that looked almost like regret. Richard's voice broke the silence. "You don't need to look back anymore. You're free now." We arrived at Richard's estate, a huge, beautiful house surrounded by perfectly kept gardens. It looked like something out of a dream. "This is your home now," Richard said, opening the front door. Inside, the house was even more stunning. High ceilings, polished floors, and walls lined with books and art. But it didn't feel cold or intimidating. It felt safe. Richard showed me to a guest room with a soft bed and a window overlooking the gardens. "Take your time settling in," he said. "We'll talk in the morning." As he left, I sat on the bed, overwhelmed. The events of the night replayed in my head, the humiliation, the anger, and then Richard showing up like a hero. For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope. The next morning, sunlight filled the room. For a moment, I forgot where I was. then, everything from the night before came rushing back. I found Richard in the dining room, seated at a long table with breakfast laid out. He smiled warmly. "Good morning. Did you sleep well?" I nodded. "Thank you for everything." Richard waved his hand. "You don't have to thank me, Sophia. What they did was wrong. It's my job to make sure you're safe now." We talked over breakfast. Richard asked me gentle questions about my interests and dreams, things I had never been allowed to explore. For the first time, someone wanted to know who I really was, not who they wanted me to be. "What do you love?" he asked. I hesitated. I used to love writing, I admitted. When I was younger, I wrote stories all the time, but my parents said it was a waste of time. Richard's expression darkened, but his voice stayed calm. "They were wrong. If writing makes you happy, you should do it." A few days later, Richard approached me in his study. "I've been thinking," he said. "You've been through a lot, Sophia. More than anyone should have to. I want you to consider therapy." The word felt strange. My parents always said therapy was for the weak, but Richard's voice was kind and caring. I realized then that I was finally safe, and maybe, just maybe, I could start healing. "I know it's a lot to think about," Richard said gently, "but getting help might make things easier. You don't have to go through this alone." I hesitated, but his calm voice made me feel safe. "Okay," I agreed. "I'll give it a try." Elena Carter, a therapist he trusted. Her office was warm and cozy, nothing like the cold, scary places I had imagined. During our first session, she let me talk at my own pace. Her kind and gentle manner helped me feel comfortable. I've always felt like I wasn't enough. I admitted softly, no matter what I did, it was never good enough for them. Dr. Carter listened closely, her face serious but caring. "That's a heavy burden to carry, but it's not yours to bear, Sophia," she said. "Their treatment of you says more about them than it does about you." Her words stayed with me long after the session, planting the first seeds of healing. While therapy helped me understand my pain, Richard encouraged me to write again. He set up a small writing corner in my room, complete with a new laptop and books on storytelling. "This is your space," he said kindly. "No pressure, just write what feels right." At first, writing was hard. It had been years, and the blank page was intimidating. But slowly, as I allowed myself to write, something changed. Writing became my escape, a way to express my feelings and find my voice again. One evening, I showed Richard a short story about a girl who escaped from a tower and found freedom. He read it carefully, then looked up at me, his eyes full of pride. "This is incredible, Sophia. You have a gift." For the first time, I felt like I was more than just the girl my parents tried to break. I was someone with dreams, talent, and a future. Months passed, and I started to adjust to my new life. Therapy with Dr. Carter helped me break down the emotional walls I had built, while Richard's support made my writing flourish. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. One day, Richard found me in the garden, writing in my notebook. He handed me a cup of tea and asked, "How's it going?" "Better than I expected," I admitted. "It feels good, like I'm finally saying things I've wanted to say for a long time." He smiled thoughtfully. "That's the beauty of writing. It gives you a voice, even when you feel like no one's listening." His words hit me deeply. For so long, I had felt invisible and voiceless, but with every word I wrote, I felt a little stronger, a little more whole. One morning, Richard gave me an envelope. My name was written on it in my mother's handwriting. "I found this in the mailbox," he said calmly. "You don't have to open it if you don't want to." My hands shook as I held the letter. Part of me wanted to tear it up, but curiosity won. I opened it slowly and read the cold, distant words. My mother wrote about how the family was worried about my decision to leave and hoped I would reconsider. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the pain they had caused, just subtle guilt and criticism. I gave the letter to Richard, feeling my throat tighten. He read it quietly, his face unreadable. "You don't owe them anything," he said firmly. "Remember that." I nodded, but the letter haunted me for days. It wasn't just their words, it was realizing they still had power over me, even from a distance. In my next session, I told Dr. Carter about the letter and my mixed feelings of guilt and anger. "It's normal to feel that way," she said. "They were your parents. You wanted their love and approval. That longing doesn't just disappear, even when you know they've hurt you." Her words resonated with me. I realized that a part of me still wanted their validation, even though I knew I would never get it. Letting go of that hope was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, but it was also freeing. As the weeks went on, I poured my emotions into my writing. Richard encouraged me to enter one of my stories into a local writing competition. I was scared, but his confidence in me gave me the courage to try. To my surprise, my story won first place. It wasn't just about the prize, it was about proving to myself that I was good enough. At the award ceremony, Richard beamed with pride. "This is just the beginning," he said. "You have so much more to give." Soon after, I received an invitation to a family gathering. At first, I wanted to ignore it, but Richard gently encouraged me. "You don't have to go for them. Go for yourself. Show them who you've become." Walking into my parents' house was hard, but I was different now. I was stronger. During dinner, my father mocked me. "I hear you've been living off Richard," he sneered. I took a deep breath and answered calmly, "Actually, I'm paying my own way. I'm in a writing program, and I just won a competition." My mother scoffed. "Writing? That's not a real career." "It is for me," I replied, standing my ground, "and I'm good at it." Richard spoke up, his voice firm. "She's better than good. She's exceptional. You should be proud of her." The room went silent. For the first time, my parents were speechless. I walked out feeling lighter, as if a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Outside, Richard placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "You handled that well." "Thanks," I whispered. It was empowering but also painful, a reminder of what could never be. "They didn't win," Richard said as we drove away. "Remember that." I looked back at the house one last time, feeling a sense of closure. I was ready to leave them behind. Determined to speak my truth, I threw myself into my writing, using my experiences as inspiration. Richard encouraged me to start a novel. "You've proven you can tell a story. Now, tell your story." The idea scared me, but his faith in me was contagious. I began writing a fictional version of my journey, escaping my family's control and finding my identity. Writing the novel was both thrilling and exhausting. Some days, the words flowed easily. Other days, I was stuck, paralyzed by self-doubt. But Richard never stopped believing in me. "Remember why you're doing this," he reminded me. "This is your story. No one else can tell it." His words kept me going, and after months of hard work, I finished the first draft. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. Richard's support went beyond just being there for me. He used his connections to introduce me to a literary agent who agreed to read my manuscript. The agent's feedback was honest and helpful. They said the story was powerful but needed some changes. Feeling motivated, I worked hard on the revisions, polishing the story like shaping a rough stone into something beautiful. As I worked on my novel, I found myself dealing with memories from my past. During a therapy session, I shared a painful memory from my childhood. I remembered standing up for myself but being shut down by my parents, which made me feel guilty for even trying. With a gentle nod, "Dr. Carter said, you tried then, and you're trying now. That strength is what brought you here." Her words struck a chord. Writing this story wasn't just about sharing my experiences. It was about taking back my voice and my life. After months of hard work, I sent the final version of my manuscript to the agent. Waiting for a response was nerve-wracking, but Richard kept reminding me, "You've already done the hardest part. Now let it find its place." When the call finally came, I was stunned. A major publisher wanted my book. I felt a rush of joy, disbelief, and pride. My story was going to be out in the world, inspiring others who had felt silenced. The day I signed the contract felt unreal. Richard was there, cheering me on. "This is just the beginning," he said. Soon, my days were filled with interviews, photo shoots, and meetings, but I didn't feel overwhelmed. I was finally telling my story, and that made it all worth it. News of my book reached my parents quickly. One evening, Richard gave me a letter from my father. It was short and filled with backhanded compliments, calling my success unexpected and lucky. It was the dismissive response I had expected. I didn't reply. I no longer needed their approval. At the book launch, the room was packed with friends, industry professionals, and readers. Richard stood by me, his support never wavering. During my speech, I said, "This book is about finding your voice, even when others try to silence you, and about the people who believe in you when you can't believe in yourself." The response from readers was incredible. Many reached out, saying they saw themselves in my journey. Every message felt like a victory, not just for me but for everyone who had felt unheard. As my book became a bestseller, the spotlight was intense. Media outlets wanted interviews, and invitations to speak at events poured in. At first, it was overwhelming, but Richard helped me stay grounded. "You're here because you earned it," he reminded me. Those words gave me strength as I faced questions about my past. I spoke my truth but never mentioned my parents by name. It wasn't about blaming them, it was about sharing my story. One evening, I received a call from Liam. He admitted he had read my book and was finally seeing things from my perspective. For years, he had been my parents' favorite, and his acknowledgement of my pain felt surreal. He apologized for not standing up for me. I accepted his apology, realizing he had his own struggles living up to our parents' expectations. Forgiving him helped us start a new relationship, no longer shaped by our parents' influence. Later, I received another letter from my parents. This time, it was different. My mother admitted they hadn't realized how much they hurt me. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was a start. When I showed it to Richard, he said, "It's up to you if you want to respond. But remember, forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means freeing yourself from their power." I chose not to reply, not out of anger but because I didn't need anything more from them. Their acknowledgement, however imperfect, was enough. I had moved on. In therapy, Dr. Carter helped me understand the letter and the feelings it brought up. "Closure isn't something they can give you," she said. "It's something you give yourself." Her words stayed with me, and over time, I felt the weight of my past lift. I was no longer defined by how my parents treated me, I was defined by the life I built despite it. When my second book was released, focusing on healing and growth, I realized how far I had come. At the launch, Richard stood by my side, beaming with pride. "This is your legacy," he said, "not the pain they gave you. This." His words brought tears to my eyes. He had been my rock, my guide, and my biggest supporter. Without him, I wouldn't have found the strength to rebuild my life. Years later, I visited Richard's estate, the place that had become my safe haven. We sat on the terrace, sipping tea as the sun set. "You've turned your pain into something that helps others," he said. I smiled, feeling at peace. My journey had been long and painful, but it led me to this moment of freedom and self-acceptance. Richard wasn't just an uncle, he was the father I always wished for. Together, we built a new kind of family, one based on love, respect, and unwavering support.